presentation. And Corey's trying to get that screen over there working. So we get that. We're doing our best, I guess.
Can you connect to it?
Last week we ended with a question. I don't think I answered very well because I didn't hear it very well. I'm getting old, as Pastor Chris was telling me. The question was,
Can you
is
connect
there
to
a
it?
difference between works and works of the law? And no, not working.
Not working.
It's a good question because we have slightly different phrases in those two places. In the book of James, chapter 2, verse 21, and in Galatians, chapter 3. And the phrase in Galatians is works of the law, and make sure you get it right away here. Galatians chapter 3 is works of the law, and in James chapter 2, it is just law. Okay? It says, was not Abraham our father justified by works? Sorry, works, not law, works. When he offered up his son Isaac on the altar. So the question is there a difference between works of the law and works? And it's kind of a tough question to answer. I think you could probably find a way to answer the question in either direction. But it's kind of like a Venn diagram. You know, we have a circle and another circle, and the two of them overlap in some places. That there could be some places where you define works apart from works of the law, and you can find some places where you define it within works of the law. And so there's a little bit of overlap there, which I know doesn't do a great job of answering the question, but I think something else that's important to see, and this is in James chapter 2. So if you turn there to begin with, James chapter 2, specifically verse 21 is the one that we're looking at. Okay, because we're talking about Abraham, and the words, Abraham believed in God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And it seems as if James and Paul have a different interpretation of that, at least when we read it on the surface, that there's a slightly different interpretation of what Genesis 15:6 means. Paul says in Galatians, Abraham believed in God, it was counted to him as righteousness. He goes on and says, so we're not saved by works of the law, but rather we are saved by faith through grace. And so we have that opposed to what James says, at least it seems that way, where it says, Abram, our father, was justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac. And that we're going to get to in a little while. Now, what I think is interesting about these two places is James chapter 2, verse 21 in the Greek. The main verb in that verse is justified. Okay? And we have it translated and understand, just because of the English language, that Abraham, the justification is a result of the works, that it's coming out of the works. In the Greek, that verb is in what we call the passive voice, meaning active. In Greek, there's an active voice, there's a middle voice, and there's a passive voice. Active voice means I'm the one doing the verb. Okay? I'm the one doing the verb. Okay? So I am punching Mark in the face. He's going to wish he never sits in the front, right? Okay? I'm doing the verb. Passive voice would be Mark. He's being punched in the face. Middle voice kind of carries both and oftentimes is used reflexively, right? I'm punching myself in the face, a la Fight Club, right? Okay? That's more middle voice. And in this verse, the word justify, which is the main verb, is in the passive voice. In other words, Abraham is receiving that work being done to him. Okay? And I think that's the idea, and it's the same idea then that Paul is putting in Galatians chapter 3. We also have another danger here, that oftentimes we want to pit the two of them against each other, Paul and James, because they appear to be saying different things, when I don't think we really should do that because of Acts chapter 21, starting in verse 17, where when Paul and Luke come to Jerusalem, the Christians there meet them and receive them gladly, including James and all the other elders, the other pastors in that area. After greeting them, Paul relates one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified God, and they said, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews and those who believe. They are zealous for the law. They have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Do what we ask you." And all this to say, when Paul comes to Jerusalem, he and James get together and have a meeting, and they're on the same page, independent even of what messages are coming through the back channels. And they're going to work together so that Paul can be welcomed into the Temple Mount because he has fulfilled the law that is necessary to go on to the temple at that time. I'm trying to explain it, I'm probably jumping around a lot. All that to say, I don't think that Paul and James are opposed to each other. Paul, in Galatians, is talking about the works that flow out of faith, but that you do not enter into the faith by means of your works, which is what we teach as Lutherans. And James is talking, I should say it backwards. I said it backwards. Paul is talking about you are not saved by doing works, and James is talking about the works that flow out of faith. Okay, I said it wrong the first time. James talks about works flowing out of faith. Paul says you're not justified by your works. But neither one of them is actually saying anything opposed to each other. They are on the same page. Doesn't help if I mix it up when I'm explaining it, does it? All right, Lynn.
Well, I like where James says that faith is completed by good works.
Where she says, I like it where James says faith is completed by works. And that's, in a sense, what we're saying, that even the word completed here, in the Greek, let me pull it up again so I'll make sure I'm saying it correctly here. In verse 22, the verb is fulfilled or made perfect or completed, and that means that that's the end of our faith. Again, saying, maybe I should go back to my first example. As a Christian, should I be punching Mark in the face? What do you think, Mark?
I think no.
You think no? Okay. Right? Why?
You're doing
It's not loving.
doing harm to a brother.
Doing harm to someone, a brother, specifically in their physical body. Right? And the law says you shall not hurt or harm your neighbor in his body. That's the fifth commandment. Jesus summarizes it that way. You shouldn't even hate them in your heart, or you are murdering. And so we as Christians seek to do what the law says, knowing that we are justified by grace apart from our works. We want to do good works, but we're saved by what Christ has done. This is a big problem that we do not do a good job of talking about right now. This is why so many people think it's okay to do whatever you want to do and still claim the title Christian. You really can't do that. We need to try and do what God says in His Word. Fulfill the law while still knowing it's because of Jesus that we're saved. Yes.
It shouldn't surprise us that justification is always under attack from one direction or another.
Sure.
And it was about 12, 15 years ago, these several evangelicals, when looking at this supposed contradiction between James and Paul, started this new perspective on Paul, and basically saying that everything Paul said about justification by grace through faith, apart from works of the law, was wrong or a mistranslation or a device of rhetoric, and it was very, very evil, wicked stuff that crept into the evangelical church. And then a bunch of Lutherans up in Finland grabbed onto it. And these modern Finns have basically denied justification. And so we need to be aware, we need to be on guard, and to hold that tension between we're justified by grace through faith on account of the person and work of Jesus, and if you're really a Christian, good works will flow from your faith. Both are true. And sometimes they seem like they're opposed to each other, but they're not. And that's how you know when you're holding these biblical tensions together. That's how you know that you're following Christ in His Word.
Yeah. And that's even, Lynn said, she likes to say it's completed. Even that verb there is in the passive voice. It's being done to. And that's the thing, right? So, it's not us actively earning our justification. It's the way faith works through us to live holy lives. Right. Right. Our faith does these things oftentimes without us even knowing.
I just want to clarify a little bit, or ask if I'm hearing this correctly. So like an example of the active voice would be, my good works complete my faith. But a better translation, or a better way to think about it, is my faith is completed by works. So is that?
We now are asking English questions. Yes, I think that's a good way. Being completed. The verb is being done by an outside source to us, to the noun. I shouldn't say to us, to the noun. So the noun here is the good works. They are being completed. No, the noun is our faith. It's being completed by the good works. Passive voice, yes. That's why we have Marlies in the office, because I'm so good at English.
But faith isn't completed by works. Faith is completed by itself. The works flow out from the faith. I don't want it to come and sound like the good works are the completion of faith.
Good works flow out of faith.
Right.
we have faith, and thereby we do the good works.
Right.
Or rightly, perhaps said, in the way this is translation maybe makes clear, God does them through us in our faith. Maybe just make it clear, not use specifically these words from this particular text. The idea is that in sin, all have died. Okay? So if Karen is dead, what is Karen going to do to be undead?
Nothing.
Nothing. How do you know that? She's dead. Now, if I get out the paddles and shock her heart and do CPR on her, and she begins to breathe and comes alive again, now that she's alive, what's she going to do to keep herself that way?
Nothing.
Nothing. Well, is she going to eat?
Well,
Is she going to drink? Is she going to look both ways before she crosses the street?
does nothing.
Still do, okay. Wear her seatbelt. And so in that way, she's doing the things to keep herself alive. She's doing these good works, constantly to stay alive, externally, passively, by some way. That's the being made alive. You have to have Jesus in your heart. That's being made alive by faith. Great. All right, if you have more questions, or if I'm old and I don't hear very well, do send me an email to make sure I understand correctly. We do our best to answer it. So we don't just avoid things. Never trying to avoid things. Oh, that's good.
So this is kind of connected to the original question that you covered at the beginning of class. If you were to define good works, how would you define good works?
If I was to define good works, how would I define good works? To define good works, I think I would look at what God says is good and right and true in His Word, which in summary would be His law. Where this is good, do this, not that. That's kind of the definition. Now, I know the challenge with that is, and this is, Paul talks about this in Galatians chapter 3 as well, if you read the whole chapter. How then can Abraham do good works? Because it will be 430 years before the law is given by God. And the answer, in a short sense, is God does not change, and what is good does not change. And we do have some definitions in a broader sense of what the law is, even as we narrow it down further and further throughout history. And so what is good and what is not good stays the same, even if it is not defined always in the same way by the Ten Commandments, right? At the time of Abraham, murdering your neighbor is not considered good. Committing adultery is not considered good. Okay? And that law is written into our hearts. The natural knowledge of God is there. Now it's all corrupted and broken because of our sin, but it's there. I don't know if you want to say any more about that before I go to the next question?
No, I think that's good.
Okay, John?
God has given us a conscience, and even those who have no faith have a conscience, and they know right from wrong.
John says God gives us a conscience, which is the same thing as that natural knowledge of God, that law written in our heart. Now, that only gets us so far, right? Because you know about your conscience, how well it works. Do you remember in first grade, the first time you said a naughty word? Okay. Or for you, Pastor, in preschool, right? The first time you said that naughty word, it was pretty exciting and fun, right? Because you knew you were doing something 100 times, your conscience didn't notice it as much. Your conscience was broken because of sin, and it wasn't as big a deal. You didn't feel as guilty. Was it less strong? No. But our consciences are corrupted by sin as well, which is why we also then do need God's law revealed in His Word. Gary?
When I said the bad word at that age, I said this is so cool right now.
Gary had soap put in his mouth. So, it's a good reminder, I guess. Matrimony is not advocated for that, parents, but it is an option, I guess. Okay, see another hand? I can't tell who it is. Tim?
Would a proof text for this, I think it's called natural law, be Romans 1, where Paul talks about the law being written in men's hearts, whether or not they agree with or accept the Ten Commandments?
That's one of the places that we go for the proof text, is Romans chapter 1, that natural knowledge of God. That it is in people's hearts. And it is, when we are being honest about what the natural law says, it does match God's law. Our challenge is, just like in Romans chapter 1, people abandon that for their own desires, because that's the more immediate reward, if you will. All right, one more thing, Tim?
One of my college professors pointed out that the way you can kind of discover natural law is not by looking at what men want to do or don't want to do, because they fool themselves all the time, like we were just saying. It's what they get mad at if somebody else does it to them.
It's what you get mad at when somebody else does it to you that reveals the natural law. That's what it says. I'm mad that you said that. All right. Let's keep going here. We're not going to get very far today. Hopefully we're answering, okay? So we're back to Genesis chapter 15. Genesis chapter 15. And I think there is something else to point out here. Abraham had just interacted, if you recall, several weeks ago. We talked about Melchizedek. And that the name Melchizedek means the king of righteousness. Okay? The word for righteousness is Zadek. And so there's an interesting parallel here where Abram runs into Melchizedek, and we heard the word from God, we confessed that word from God, then a few verses later, and now a few more verses later, Abram believes in God, and now that righteousness is counted to him. What I think is interesting here that we need to see in ourselves and talk a little bit about in the sermon today, and with the baptism as well. In the waters of baptism, we are declared righteous for the sake of our King of righteousness, Jesus Christ. We are clothed in the robe of His righteousness that covers all of our sin. And with this parallel being carried through here in these verses, you see a similar idea with Abram. He now has the same righteousness that the King of righteousness was talked about having a few verses before, as a result of his faith. Okay? And so we see that being carried out there as well, just like it is for you and for me. Now, what I'd like to end then on today is talking about a covenant. Because in the next verses 7 through 11, which we'll begin next week, we're going to hear about God and Abram making a covenant. And we're going to see in this particular section of Scripture very clearly how it is that a covenant is made. Okay? And remember, a covenant is a legally binding contract between two entities. Okay? Just like I have a covenant with my mortgage company that I will pay however much every month, and in return, even though they technically own the house now, they will let me continue to live there until such time as I finally paid off the whole thing, and then it belongs to me. Or maybe you have a legally binding contract with a business partner or something like that. Now, in our day and age, those legally binding contracts, we write down all the words on paper, and lawyers are the ones who carry out the punishments and things like that to make sure they are fulfilled. Okay? That's why everybody loves lawyers so much, right? Okay? No offense, Joe. Okay. That's not the way covenants were made in Old Testament times. In Old Testament times, covenants were made by taking animals and you cut the animal in half. And then you have half the animal here and half the animal there, and the two parties who are making the agreement stand in the middle. Now, when you cut an animal in half and you lay the two sides opposite each other, what's left in the middle where you were doing the cutting? Okay, everyone go home this week and cut an animal in half.
Blood.
Blood. And it's kind of gory when you cut an animal in half. So the two parties stand in the middle in the blood, and they make their agreement. They say, this is your end of the deal, this is my end of the deal, this is what will happen if you break it, this is what will happen if I break it. And essentially the agreement is if you break the covenant, the other party gets to make you like that animal whose blood you're standing in. If you violate the covenant, the other party has the right, and maybe you could say even the obligation, to kill you. And it's not enforced by lawyers, but it's enforced by the other party. Okay? This is important because we're going to see next week when we begin to look at Genesis 15 how that happens. Now, the agreement that you're making with the other party is often written on what was called an ostraca, okay, a potsherd, okay, because they have lots and lots of potsherds. Pots broke all the time. So you would take the potsherd and you would write the agreement on it. In fact, you would take two potsherds and you would write the agreement on both, and each party then got to have a copy of the agreement so that they knew that they weren't breaking it. Now that part maybe seems silly to mention, but there's some speculation that the reason there were two tablets when God wrote the Ten Commandments with Moses is that the idea is that both sides get a copy. Okay? Just like they did in the covenant here. You each get a copy of the agreement so that you know what you need to do and how to keep it. We're going to see a covenant made between God and Abram, but interestingly, when we read the text, we see that it's actually only God who stands in the middle. And that points us forward then to our Lord Jesus Christ, who is God and man, and takes all the punishment for our breaking of God's covenant, our breaking of the law, upon himself as a man. But he's also then receiving the divine punishment of God for that sin as well. Both ends of the deal, God is taking upon himself here. Okay? And we're going to talk more about that then next week when we read these words and look at it. And God is going to appear in the midst of the animals in smoking flame. And in that way, both ends of the agreement he's going to fulfill. Okay. Final questions, Linda?
Does this have anything to do with Andy's gate at some of our religious ceremonies?
Does this have anything to do with the Agnus Dei that's often on some of our pyramids? And when we say Agnus Dei in that way, we mean there's the little lamb. Okay, the picture's the lamb, and he's wounded with blood, and there's a cross usually on his shoulder. Yes, that is pointing forward to that as well.
Was another part of having that on broken concrete that it would be, you would put it on there and break it, and then only those two pieces would fit together. That way you had an authenticity of like a tally stick. I was learning about those the other day.
Tally sticks, yeah.
Yeah, same kind of thing. I didn't know if that was part of it.
I don't know if that's part of it or not. I'd be nervous saying that without knowing that for sure, especially because has anybody ever dropped a flower pot? It's hard to get it to break the way you want it, but it's definitely a possibility. Just don't know if that's across the board. Okay. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you